now on YouTube, so it's saved for people afterwards. Okay. And so thank you very much for being here. And so now we're very happy to listen to Khenpo.
So before we begin, it's always important to start with a proper motivation. So let's begin by reciting the prayers for the Refuge and Bodhichitta. We'll recite them in Tibetan because I think most of you probably know these prayers. This is a short one. And then we'll recite the four immeasurables, and then we'll begin the talk. O sanje chedan tsogi chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum chi dage jinso gi besanam gi drola penjer sanje robar sho sanje chedan tsogi chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum chi dage jinso gi besanam gi drola penjir sanje robar sho sanje chedan sogi chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum chi dagi jinso gi besanam gi drola penjir sanje robar sho semje tamje dewa tang dewe judan dembar jurchi donga dan donga ji judan rawar jurchi donga mebe dewa tamba tam min rawar jurchi nirin shadan nitang rawe tanyon chembola nebar jurchi. So first of all, I would like to say good morning or afternoon or midday, whatever time of day it is for you. Hello or good afternoon or good morning, whatever. It's always hard to tell on Zoom. And I would like to thank Drupchen and the Dharma Sagar organizers for inviting me to come and speak with you about translation. And so I'm very happy to have this opportunity. I mean, as a translator, of course, I think that translation is important. But otherwise I wouldn't be doing it, I suppose. But but I think it's also wonderful that it's that we're having translations into more and more languages. And as I look at your names, and I know some of you from before, I see that we're mainly people, translating into Spanish and Portuguese, and maybe some French, I don't know, maybe Italian, I don't know, but maybe mainly the Romance languages. And I think this is absolutely wonderful. There are so many people in the world who Tibetans assume must speak English because they have big noses and yellow hair, but who don't actually speak English, or for whom English is a second language. And it's important that everyone can get the Dharma in their own language as much as we can. And so that's why I'm so glad to see so many of you joining in today. And I think in terms of, we're talking about having a few classes over the next few weeks. And I think it's important for us to start really from what is the most, when you think about what is the most important thing about translating. What is going to, and what is the main thing that is the main factor that is going to determine whether your translation works or whether it doesn't work? what is the main thing we have to think about? Because you can, I mean, if we look at it on one level, you would say, oh, the first thing is, oh, you have to have really good Tibetan to be able to translate. Well, that's obvious. I mean, but actually how good your Tibetan is a different matter. And there are actually some people who can probably translate fairly well if they get some help, even if their Tibetan is not really up to snuff, particularly when you're doing written translation. And that's something we'll come back to at another point. But so having good Tibetan is important, but it is not the most important thing, because you can have excellent Tibetan and not be able to translate. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing you might have, and one of the reasons you might have excellent Tibetan and not be able to translate is it because you have no idea about the Dharma that you're trying to translate. And I'm assuming that you're all planning to translate Tibetan for Dharma reasons, because there are some academics who study Tibetan culture and Tibetan history, but it's really not the main reason why people are interested in the Tibetan language. So you have to know some bit of Dharma. So you might understand all of the words and not be able to put together and get any sense out of it because you don't know the Dharma. So you might think, well, you really have to know the Dharma. If you know the Dharma, then the Tibetan will kind of work its way out. And maybe yes, maybe no, but even that's not the most important thing, because you have to look at, what is your actual level of understanding of the Dharma? Is it intellectual understanding? Do you have some experience? I mean, obviously the best is we'd have realization, but I don't have any realization, and I hope that all of you have realization, and I don't. I mean, I'd much prefer that than the other way around. So, and I should probably take it as an assumption that when I'm speaking today, that you all have some degree of realization, and I'm just, I'm just a poor, I don't. I can't pretend that I do. So, the level of Dharma understanding is important, but it's not the most important thing. And the most important thing, actually, when it comes down, what it really comes down to the basic fundamental process, what's really going to determine whether your translation works or not is your motivation. That is the number one most important thing. And we often hear this, like when lamas and teach the Dharma, they always begin by reminding us to go for refuge or to rouse bodhicitta. Now, sometimes it comes in a rather formulaic phrase in Tibetan, but they're still reminding us to do it. And they often remind us again and again in the teachings. They also remind us by their examples of what they do. So it's the same. In a sense, our translation is like an extension of our Dharma practice. When you do any Dharma practice, you have to begin by going for refuge and having bodhicitta. So it's important again for us when we're translating, in the sense that it's a way for us to, if you look at it in terms of the three types of discipline, you've got the discipline of refraining from bad actions, the discipline of gathering virtuous qualities, and the discipline of benefiting others. And so translating falls squarely within the third one, and it probably also has a lot of aspects of the second, gathering virtuous qualities. And so really, when you think about translation, if you approach it with the right attitude, it can be a Dharma practice. And so therefore, you need to approach it with a Dharmic attitude, because if we don't, then it's not going to work. And even whether or not it becomes a Dharma practice, that's kind of that's maybe a little, it's almost new agey way of speaking about it. Everything's a practice, everything's, we don't necessarily need to think about things in that way. Really what we need to think about, if you want to translate, we want our translations to actually help people. We want people to actually get something out of it. We want people to actually be able to read and understand the Dharma and improve their own practice. So that's why we're doing it. Now, if you want your translations to actually help other people, you have to somehow connect with them. It's really important to make a connection with your listener or your reader, because there are two types of translations. And I believe that you're mainly working on written translation. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. But there's also oral interpretation. These two are related. They're very different in some ways, but they're related. But in either case, you want to make a connection to your reader. And when your reader or your listener, and when you are beginning with a good motivation, then it's possible to make a connection to the other person. If you are not, you will be unable to make the connection to the audience that that you want to make, that you need to make if you're doing this. So it's really important for us to, at the very beginning, when you do translations, when you start on a project, you should really think to yourself, what's your motivation? When you are sitting down if you've got a couple hours to work on a written session, you should think, why am I doing this? If you are interpreting a session of orally, you need to think, why am I doing this? What is important about it? If you begin by thinking about your motivation, then everything else is going to follow from that. And actually, there's a lot of different things that follow primarily from our motivation. So the most important thing is to think about our motivation. So for ordinary people, such as myself, it's difficult to truly have a motivation of bodhicitta. I mean, we try. In a sense, we're beginning, I imagine that most of you have probably also taken the Bodhisattva vow and recited it and, recite it daily or maybe several times a day, whatever. But actually, when push comes to shove, to really be taking the Bodhisattva vow to heart and be acting on it at least 50% of the time. Even 50% of your waking time is hard. But when we begin something, if you start out with that motivation of bodhicitta, it's really very beneficial and very important for making sure that what you're going to do is in the end going to benefit people. And I say this from experience because one of the big things, the biggest problems that we have for translators is that we start to think that we know something better than other people. After all, we're the translator. You get there and you think, oh, I understand this better. I have studied this. I'm looking at this. I'm studying it now. I'm getting special teachings on it from a Khenpo. I'm doing this. I've got all this. And now I'm translating it. I know this better. And that turns into pride. If you're doing oral interpretation in particular, this is a big problem because you say something that sounds kind of nice coming out of your mouth. Whether or not it's actually what the Lama said is an entirely different matter. You say something that sounds good, you put it together in coherent English or Portuguese or Spanish or whatever language, and you put it out and it sounds nice and people look and they get this little bit of, adulation. And it's really easy to start getting a little bit full of yourself. In other words, pride. And then you get an idea, well, there are all these other translations of this text, but I'm going to do one. They've all got problems. I'm going to do one that's better. And so you have this idea, I'm going to do one that's better. Because you have this fixation that you are going to do it better and that you can and that you will, you're going to be blind to actually how the translation is working. So I did this, and it can, even when you start out with a good motivation, it can come back to you. For example, in 2004 or 5, the Gyalwang Karmapa wrote new tunes for the Vajradhara lineage prayer, a couple new tunes in Tibetan. And then later that year, there was a teaching for the Chinese and a teaching students and teaching for Western students. And the teaching for the Chinese students, they sang the Vajradhara lineage prayer in Chinese and half the audience was crying. And I thought, oh no, we can't do this in English with our current translations. And I kept that in mind and thought, well, we have to do one. And so I tried one. And I got it to work. if you already knew the how to fit it to the tune, it was not easy. And it actually was a little bit of it really was not a very good translation. But I'd figured out a way to put it against the melody. And I thought, now people are going to feel faith when they sing the Vajradhara lineage prayer, and no one else could sing it. What's going on? And then someone else saw it and they said, this is word salad. It's like, great. This is actually some of the best translation advice I'd ever received. It's like, your translation is word salad. This is great. Thank you very much. It's much better to get criticized, really. And so, then I realized that, yes, there were a lot of problems in the translation beyond whether or not it could be sung with a melody. I mean, it just, you had to know the melody beforehand. It just didn't work. But I could not see that when I was working on it because I had this idea that I got attached to. So you have to be really, really careful in your motivation. So we have to begin with the motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that by doing this translation, can we help bring the people who read this translation, whether they read it in the short term of the next few years or the long term of generations from now, if our translations even survive, may it be able to benefit them so that they can then, go down the path and achieve experience realization and become Buddhists. That's what we want from that's what we should want from our translations. We should think to ourselves, may this really benefit someone so that they can really understand the Dharma and really gain true benefit for themselves and others. So starting with that motivation is really the number one thing, and it's going to make a big difference. Whether you are doing oral interpretation or whether you are doing written translations, this motivation is absolutely critical. And so you have to think about it very carefully. And it's important to try to keep it in mind no matter what you're doing. And anytime you begin a session, any project, you should try to keep that motivation of bodhicitta in your mind and in your heart. So that's really the main thing. And when you think about why is it the main thing, well, you have to think about what the point of a translation is. What is the main purpose for translating? I mean, the ultimate purpose, okay, so I mean, if we talk about it in terms of the 5 levels of purpose, you've got the topic, this matter, and so forth. But traditionally we talk about the purpose and the essential purpose, right? So the essential purpose is to bring everyone to Buddhahood, right? We want to bring it, but there's the purpose, there's how, the kind of short term, how do we want to bring them to Buddhahood? And there are different ways to think about this. Usually, like when you're translating something, you can think about it as, especially if you're doing something that's a little bit more scholastic, scholarly, you can think about it as your main purpose is to convey the information that is in the Tibetan in your own language. Think, okay, you translate it so that people can understand the meaning, excuse me, the people reading in Spanish or Portuguese can understand the meaning that was communicated in Tibetan. But this is not quite what it is. There are a lot of translations that communicate the meaning, but that do not communicate the entire, what do we say? The entire Gestalt, to use a German word, since you're all Romance language translators, the entire feeling of the work. For example, there are a number of translations of the Way of the Bodhisattva, and I just added one to them. There are now even more that you can pick, and there probably will be other translations done in the future. And if you look at the English translations, there is one that I would like to, that is actually really very good translation, the translation by Vesna Wallace and Alan Wallace. Now, people always say it was Alan Wallace who translated, but when I look at the preface, I think it primarily was Vesna Wallace who was working on it most, translating it from Sanskrit. And when you look, this translation is actually very, very, what do we say? It's very, very good for the meaning. One moment, please. Unless you want to hear the gong. I have to close the window. We're going to get some sound from outside. Oh, close close it down a little bit. It's not the most attractive of things to see on the Zoom, is it? Me cranking that. Okay. So this translation is a really very good translation of the meaning. And I do highly recommend this translation if you want to get another sense of the meanings, particularly since she's working from mainly from the Sanskrit. And yet, when you look at the form, of course, Shantideva's imagery is so beautiful that it's almost impossible to do a translation of the way of the Bodhisattva that isn't beautiful in some respect. But it doesn't have everything. It's missing something. It's missing a lot of the feeling, and that feeling comes from like the translation technique. She translated it in prose. It's written in verse. And there are differences. And when you have something written in verse, it gives you a different feeling than something that's written in prose. It's kind of like, I mean, we all, the verses in our own language is just, all have certain rhythms and so forth. And there are different levels and different kinds of verse and different ways of working about language. But when you're working with verse, whether you're thinking about sort of a classical sort of verse, or whether you're thinking about even some of the more contemporary forms of verses, and not that you can necessarily do it, but you could even like some of the rhythms in like rap. There's a lot of rhythm that communicates feeling. And it's different than just spoken language, regular spoken language or regular prose. So you have to see that. So when you look at these translations, it takes something that's written in verse in the original and then translate it into something that's communicating all the information. There's nothing left out. There are no mistakes, maybe a couple of different interpretation. Interpretation is fine. I don't mind different interpretations. There are really no major mistakes. I can't think of any mistakes in the Wallace translation. And yet it falls flat because the language is prose. It's very flat. So what's it not do? It's communicating the meaning, but it's not communicating the feeling. So it's really important for us to understand in how is it that we are communicating, that we need to communicate the feeling, because otherwise you're not getting the whole thing about the work. So just merely translating the meaning alone is not enough. So of course you have to have the meaning accurate. That's important. And we'll speak about that in another session. But the main thing is that instead of thinking about translating the meaning, you can think about this in two ways. One is that you have to translate the feeling. The other way of thinking about it is instead of saying translate the feeling, you have to think the function of this is to instill faith. So, and the way to instill faith is by translating the meaning. The reason why it's important to translate in a way that will bring faith to the person is that all of our Dharma practice depends upon faith. Even in the way of the Bodhi, in the Ultimate Lama, it says the self-verism ultimate, realizing the self-verism ultimate depends only on faith. But before I go on, because especially, those of us from Christian cultures, when you say faith, the understanding of faith in European and in Christianity in particular is different than the meaning of faith in Buddhism. And I'm sure that you've all heard this before, but, we talk about the three types of faith: the longing faith, the sincere faith, and the faith of conviction, the faith of belief, really understanding and believing things. And in all respects, Buddhist faith depends upon knowing, understanding. It's not, in Christianity, faith is thinking, I don't know there's no way to know about God and no way to know about Jesus, but I'm going to believe anyways. No proof, but I'm going to believe. And there's a certain strength to that. And I think that I've met some people who are really sincere Christians who have very strong faith, who I would say have some degree of these are ordinary people, but I think they have a good degree of spiritual understanding because of their faith. Now, but in Buddhism, In some ways, faith is similar, but the difference is that you have to have the basis. So even when the basis is understanding and knowledge, it's the faith of sincere faith, sort of the clarity, the purity of your intent. There's the longing faith of really wanting to become a Buddha, wanting to, and then there's the faith of conviction, which comes from understanding, from listening and contemplating, and having that understanding. So this is what we want to instill in our listeners, or in our audience, I should say, because we have some readers. So in your audience, you want them to be able to develop faith of one of these three kinds, because it's by having that faith and that confidence that they will be able to make progress on the path towards enlightenment. So this is even in the case of texts that seem like they are dry philosophical works. An example is there's one of these works, and I actually think the translation of the work is fine. It's a good translation. It has an introduction to it. And in the introduction to this work, and I'm not going to name it because I don't want anyone to think I'm criticizing anyone. I mean, I am, but I don't want anyone to know who I'm. I'm pointing out a problem. In the introduction, it says, this text is just a long set of lists, one list after the other. All the commentaries say that this is in order to, that the main point of this text is to instill faith, but it's difficult to see how you can gain faith out of reading a line of lists like this. Well, if you think of faith as only being the first type of faith, the sincere faith, you're right. Maybe. And not even that, because this is the same work that when I'd studied it in Shedri, even though it was a long set of lists, it was like, wow, this is great. This is amazing. And I felt a lot of faith before I even read the other translators. Comment. And maybe he was just saying that. I have to admit, I closed the book and put it away for a year, and I didn't read the rest of the introduction after I read that. And he could have explained himself 2 pages later, but I closed the book and put it away right then. So I'm probably even making a completely unfair category, because I know that this translator, he's a very good translator, and he knows his stuff, and he understands about the different types of faith. But so even when you have something that seems like it's really thorny material, for example, I've been working on a lot of logic for many years, and I've, Dharma Kirti, I've worked on Abhidharma before that. You look at it on the outset, and it just seems like a way to give yourself a headache. How are you going to give yourself faith by reading this material? But as translators, we have to remember that faith, making people able to understand, is a way of giving them faith. Making it so that when people read something, they get a feeling out of it gives them faith. Making them feel like, especially if you're talking about one of these, works, a more devotional work that makes people, talks about the qualities of the lamas or the gurus or, historical figures, the Dharma, whatever, and they read it and it makes them feel faith, then that is good. Because you can translate these same works in multiple ways, in many different ways. And what's going to come out depends upon your intention to begin with. For example, there is a lot of academic research these days, and it's all available online now. It's very easy to get. And it's actually a great resource. And there are a lot of academics who are doing excellent work. But when your motivation is an academic motivation, then your style of translation is going to be different. Again, the way the Bodhisattva provides a really good example of that. There is also translation of the way the Bodhisattva that came out in 2016 or 2017. It was, what's his name? The one who passed away a few years ago, the professor. Is it Jose Cabazon in California? Is he the one or a different one? Anyways, his translation came out, and again, I'm not going to quibble about the meaning, but he's got an academic attitude, and so he's translating in a very academic way. Is it a good translation? Yes. But his intention isn't to instill faith. His intention is to kind of recreate the feeling of the Sanskrit or the Tibetan or whatever he was looking at. I think he was probably looking at both. And so his, again, like the Wallace translation, his translation does not really communicate the feeling of the work. So this is why it's important to remember what our faith is, because the faith is going to or the understanding that this is the intention is going to then be reflected in the words you choose, the way you express them, the level of language that you use, and so forth. Now, there are many different genres, and there are devotional works, there are sutras, there are all sorts of different works. And with all of these different types of genres, you have to use different types of language. But the one common thing that has to happen in our translations of all of is that they have to sound like something people would say in our own languages. Otherwise, we're not going to communicate faith. So if you make the reader work too hard, now, if you make the reader work harder in your language than the author makes them work in Sanskrit or Tibetan, then there's a problem. The reader should be able to, especially if you're doing something simple and devotional, if you're doing, like a lot of you probably are interested in doing pith instructions of various sorts, like Mahamudra or Dzogchen instructions, you might be interested in doing instructions on Bodhichitta or meditation. And for those things, you want to be able to use words and language. You want to use language that can make people feel, say, oh, I get it. That's how I have to do it. Because that's the point of that work. So if you're using language that makes them not get it, then they're not going to, then they aren't going to do it. So this means like we have, there's a Tibetan word, for example, and like when you're talking about meditation instructions, we often talk about jodo. Actually, we talk about jodo all the time. So jodo is the Tibetan word that in English is translated in a number of different ways. It's translated as impositions, superimpositions, and all these different things. And, when I first started translating, I was translating a teaching of Trungpa Rinpoche's, and Rinpoche was talking about jodo. And I looked in the dictionary, and the dictionary said impositions. So I was talking about impositions. And we had a review session later that day, and a student said, what are impositions? What does it mean? And when I started to answer, I realized I myself did not know. I was using this English word. I didn't really know what the English word meant. Forget about what the Tibetan word meant. Because I'd taken the word in the dictionary. It's a kind of a funny word, but it's the one that everyone uses. And I use this word impositions, or nowadays people are using superimpositions. And it's like, oh, it's even more of an imposition. So what does it actually mean? In English, it turns out we have an extremely simple and common word that everyone is going to understand. And that is a projection. So you got to use the word that people actually understand instead of thinking about some, technical thing. So what this is showing is that your initial motivation of bodhicitta, or as close to bodhicitta as you can get, the understanding that the function of the translation is to instill faith or to communicate feeling, which I think are actually different ways of saying the same thing. Then all of your other translation decisions, down to even the smallest level of what words are you going to use, follow from that. So that is why this is the most important thing. Because when you sort of take the implications of what does it mean to translate with bodhicitta, so then you think, well, why am I doing that? I want to help beings. So how do you help beings? You help them by either, making them feel faith or just making them have a feeling. Making them gain an understanding is gaining faith, right? Gaining the third type of faith. So this is why we're translating. When you understand that, then it makes you feel more like, okay, I need to do this. If you are meditating, or if you're translating out of the motivation instead of thinking, I've done the study, I know the Tibetan, this is what this word means. If you don't understand it, it's your problem. You're never going to communicate anything. So that's really the most important thing to think about when you're beginning. And that it also, of course, means when I think a lot of you are beginning. I know some of you are in your second, or some of you have been studying for a few years, some for a couple of years. Some of you might be new to studying Tibetan and thinking about translating. So it also, when you think about it with that motivation, it also means you need to keep that motivation in mind when you, what do we say? When you're doing your studies. And then it's even how you're approaching the language studies. Now, I've been speaking for quite a while already, and I think we have about an hour today. So maybe I'll say just a little bit about sort of the implications for the studies. Because there are many different ways to study Tibetan, and many different ways to learn Tibetan. But what you want on the end is, if the end is that you want to be able to get translations that instill faith or make people feel something or understand something, then you have to actually be able to get that feeling yourself, which takes a while. It took a long time. It was years. There were these Tibetans who would be saying, oh, that song is really beautiful. And I'd read it and it's like, what's beautiful about it? I don't understand. It took me, I think there was something that the Karmapa wrote in 2011 that I thought, oh, yes, this is beautiful. But then that was like the first. And then it wasn't like until a couple of years later that I actually started feeling like, oh, this is what it means. They say that Tibetan is beautiful. This is what we actually mean. And I'm not sure I can still put my finger on it. But, you have to have a feeling for the language. In other words, if you're going to be able, you have to know what's the feeling in Tibetan. If you don't know what the feeling is in Tibetan, then you won't be able to communicate the feeling in your own language, right? So you have to get that. Now, the feeling sometimes comes through in the commentaries, like with the Way of the Bodhisattva as an example. There are the commentaries. You can read them and get some sort of sense of the feeling of those of the words from the commentaries, but a lot of it also comes from the words, the rhythm of the words, the use of language, all the what we'd call literary devices. I mean, if you studied your Portuguese or Spanish in high school or university, and your teachers are going on about poetry and literary devices, well, you should try to remember what they said. And then try to think of it for your own for the translation, but also, how does it apply? What do we do in Tibetan that makes that? And the example is in Tibetan. In verse, you have the very standard rhythms, especially in the Tibetan verse, the 7-syllable line, the 9-syllable line. Well, how do they go in your? What are they? How do you get feeling about? What is it about it that gives them feeling? How do the verses work in Tibetan? So getting that feeling, and then you're able to do that. And that means that you have to try to do as much as you can to get kind of a more organic feeling of Tibetan. If you are approaching Tibetan in a mechanical way, then your translations are going to end up being mechanical. A good example of this, there's a translation I read a number of years ago by someone who decided he was going to follow the example of the great Tibetan translators of the past and translate every piece of Tibetan into English. And every Tibetan prefix got its own particular Tibetan word. He had his own particular English word correlation. And he had this terminology that was actually a very idiosyncratic terminology. And I picked up the book. I read his introduction. It was very well written, very informative. I got to the translation and I couldn't understand what he was saying. I had to go back to the Tibetan. I could only understand his English when I went back and looked at the Tibetan. And when I did that, I saw that what he had done was actually a very impressive exercise. I mean, how impressive is it? It didn't communicate. You read it and you didn't get it. You didn't understand it. I had to work harder to read it in English than I did in Tibetan. So if you are approaching it as like translating a source code in one computer language to translating a source code into the source code in another computer language, it's not going to communicate anything. So you have to be able to appreciate language as a language and not as like a puzzle. And if you can do that, so it's important to keep that in mind when you are also studying, that we want to be able to see about what can you do to get your Tibetan into like a living language for you. Something maybe you aren't going to be quite as comfortable with it as you are in in your own native language. I mean, it's very hard to get that comfortable in any language when you're studying, especially when it's different from our Western languages as Tibetan. But if you have to do what you can to be comfortable, not just in Dharma language, but also in terms of actually being able to speak and use the language. Because if you can speak and use the language on a day-to-day level, then you will be able to feel when you're reading the texts that you're looking at, you'll be able to get a feeling like, this is what it means. This is what it's talking about. This is the feeling of the text. And then you can try to recreate or see how do you bring that feeling. Often you don't really have to try. You just have to open yourself up and sort of think about what can I do? Let yourself play with your own language when you're actually doing the translation to get something that then communicates feeling, gain a little bit of experience on that. So this is but again, this all comes back down to your motivation. If your motivation is to translate Tibetan the same way you can translate, like doing a puzzle, you don't need to study Tibetan much. You just need to have a good dictionary and do what this other translator did, and your translations will be, of academic interest. And that's about it. So I think that is maybe enough for right now. Enough of me, and I need to leave something to say for the next time. But maybe you all have some questions that you would like to ask.
Yes. Hello. My name is Mikael, and I'm from Portugal. So I'm new here, and I'm very, very new to Tibetan. I don't know much at all. So where should I begin to learn Tibetan? Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of learning Tibetan, I think part of that's part of the Dharma Sagar program. Is learning, is it not part of the, so that's one resource, or Drupchen can help you with resources for learning Tibetan. At the beginning, and there are places where you can learn online. Actually, there are places in India. If they're allowing foreigners back in India, so if you feel like you want to try going to India, you can also go and study at places. There are several places in Dharamsala, among them the Sukhya, but there are also other places where you can study. So there are places where you can study, and that's one issue. But the other issue is like when you're beginning, at the very beginning. What I think is actually one of the most important things to do is to get a really good command of reading in Tibetan. To be able to look at a Tibetan text and to be able to just read it, not to understand, but to pronounce it aloud. And it's important to have some guidance in getting the right pronunciation doing this, because there are the differences in Tibetan sounds are different than what we expect in our own language. Every language has its own sort of sets of different sounds. And there are sounds in Tibetan that sound indistinguishable, at least to English ears. For example, if you take the first three consonants, ga, ka, ga, in English, you could reasonably transliterate any of the three with a K. But K, an English K, is not really any of the three. So you have to learn, what's the difference between these different, what are the pronunciations, and get used to doing this, and train your mouth. Because when you train your mouth and saying them properly to begin with, then everything will, all your pronunciation will be much clearer, and you'll be able to hear them better. When you can pronounce the difference between ga, ka, ga, then you will be able to hear the difference between the three. So that's just an example. Same with all of the 30 consonants. And there are some pairs that you have to work on that are kind of similar, and the sa and sa and the sha, sha. So these are, you have to be able to hear the differences between those pairs of letters, which takes a while. It also means that you have to be able to do them. The other thing is that one hurdle I've noticed with people who are learning Tibetan is that they want to be able to read, but they're not confident enough in actually looking at the alphabet and putting together to get the sound out of it. Forget about the meaning, to get the sound out of it, because it's different than our than our Roman alphabet. And so we have to put the time in at the beginning to learn how to read. And I think learning how to read, and then reading, just practicing reading for 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day until you can be really comfortable reading. Maybe not like the monks in the monasteries or the nuns in the nunneries, but when you can be comfortable reading. Then when you are given something, your teacher gives you something written in Tibetan, you'll be able to look and say, you'll be able to at least pronounce it, which gives you more. So getting that familiarity with the writing system and the reading is really a very important thing at the beginning. And I didn't do it myself. And I realized later that I had some problems of I had some problems later on, just because I couldn't keep up in the reading. I couldn't read clearly. So that's one of the main things. But there are many different programs. I see someone just mentioned that there's a Manjushri program that's in Darjeeling. There are lots of programs that you can learn. But the most important, and really, I think any of the programs, if you go in with the willingness to learn, you can get something out of it. Some are better than others, but Dharamsala is good. Darjeeling, they've had some good teachers over the years. So that's the main thing. And also whatever, Drupchen is organizing, I'm sure is good. So it depends upon your life situation, but putting some effort in. Once you have studied, the next thing actually is it's important to use it in real life. Where my Tibetan actually went from being kind of funky Tibetan that only people who knew me could understand to being actually Tibetan that other people could understand was when I was actually made to work in Tibetan. So once you get the basics, then it's good to try to find a position where you actually have to use it. But that's a little bit down the road for you. So begin with like the alphabet, do some of these programs for study, either online or in person. And then eventually when you get to a point where you can hold your own, maybe not great, but you can get through things, then you want to put yourself in a position where you actually have to use the language.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, is that it for questions today?
I have a question. Actually,
okay.
It's a little bit. I would ask you to share with us a little bit how you started translating and what is your process of translation. with your mind?
Okay. How did I start translating? Well, I had gone to Nepal to do a little bit of study and retreat with Rinpoche, and I've always enjoyed languages, so I just picked up a few words of Tibetan, but I couldn't really say much. I could say pleasantries, and I went to Nepal. And then I went a second time, and I learned a few more pleasantries, but really couldn't say much. And then Rinpoche noticed, and he told me I should move to Nepal and learn Tibetan, become a translator. And then at that time, there weren't as many programs. This was in 2001, 2002. There weren't as many opportunities to learn Tibetan. And people said, well, you also have to study the Dharma, and immersion is best. So I thought, okay, I'll just join the Shedra, the monastic college in Namabuddha. And after I had been in the monastic college for a year, less than a year, Rinpoche's attendant came to me and said, Rinpoche is giving medicine Buddha empowerment, and he needs a translator. It starts in 10 minutes. I go upstairs, and Rinpoche is sitting on there. I sit down, and Rinpoche says something, and it's like, It was not an auspicious beginning. So, and then, but basically what happened is then after, a few years after that, I started translating for Rinpoche a little bit more regularly and took time. And Rinpoche was really very kind with me. He first let me flail a little bit, and every little while he'd give me a piece of advice. And do this, try that. And it always worked. He was always right because he's Rinpoche. So, and then I would just follow the instructions. And then eventually, at the beginning, I look back at, I was a pretty dreadful translator. I'm sorry for the students who had to sit through those teachings where I was translating. And then eventually, I got more and more experience. And then I thought I was something. And then I started serving the Gyalwang Karmapa, and he put me to work in all sorts of different ways, but he didn't let me translate for a long time, for about like 5 years. And then finally I thought, okay, I'm happy. Then 1 year for the Kaji Munlam, the regular translator couldn't come. I was organizing translators, but not translating. The substitute translator came, or they called someone else. He came, he did a good job. And thought, okay, I'm happy just organizing. And then, what do you say? Happy just organizing. And then and I thought, I don't care if I'm going to translate again. And then after that, then someone started asking me to translate. So it was only one side actually stopped wanting to do it. So that's the oral translating. And the written translation was like, I just giving it, started out kind of as a joke, and not a joke, as like a little exercise in my last year of Shedra, that I was studying Abhidharma. And it seemed to me like, well, this is written in verse, and this could be expressed in English verse. So I started playing with it, and that kind of grew into the translation, Jewels of the Treasure, which is my first major translation. It needs revision, but it's okay. It needs revision, though. So that's how it goes. So I didn't really have any formal training. It's kind of trial by fire, guidance from first Rinpoche, and then later from the Gyalwang Karmapa. And some important pieces of advice. The most important piece of advice, there are two important pieces of advice. And the first one was when Rinpoche told me that I had to make people laugh when I was doing oral translation. And he said, you're not colorful enough. You're not vivid enough. It's like, oh, okay. And because that really actually got me to open up. The second one was that the Karmapa said, when you're translating, the people have to hear the love in your voice. So the love has to come through your voice. It has to come through when you're doing a written translation. It needs to come through the words. When you're translating Abhidharma, it's harder to see. When you're translating epistemology, it's even harder, but you have to try to find a way to bring it through.
Thank you. Do you have any, I don't know, for written translation specifically, do you have any method you apply for when you are going to start a new text, let's say, for instance, to approach the text and how you work over it?
That's a big topic, and that I think is actually one of the topics for the next time. And it depends a bit on the size of the text and your familiarity with the subject matter and all that. So it's there are different every different project has a different set of parameters to it, but there's some general principles. Basically, the first. You have to gather all the sources you can and look at as many different sources. You can't just rely on one source, because if you rely on one source, you're going to have a slanted interpretation. You need to use as many different sources and compare them as you can. Even if you're going to rely on one primarily, you need to also make sure that your translation can accommodate other interpretations. And so you have to have all the different sources. You have an idea. You have to have some knowledge of it, and preferably some background in the background study in the issue. And then you go through the process of doing. I usually recommend people to do like a horrid first draft, where you just spit it out, and not expecting that you're going to get anything good. In fact, expecting that it's going to be a horrid first draft. That's why I always call it the horrid first draft. And then you kind of add, then you go through and you edit, and you go through and the editing process. So that's the basic way that it goes. But gathering sources, looking through sources, and most of all, not thinking you actually know anything. That's the most important. If you realize you don't know a diddly squat, then you're probably going to be able to come up with a better translation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. So maybe that is enough for today. We've gone for a little bit over an hour now, so we can rejoin. I guess what next Saturday is at the same time.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. Now let us finish by dedicating the merit. So think to yourself that the merit of discussing and listening to the translation, this thinking of and listening to the ideas about translation, and thinking about it is going to be, thinking that the merit of doing this is going to bring benefit to all sentient beings, and may it bring all sentient beings to the state of Buddhahood and freedom from all suffering. Osanam de tam je sivani tomne nye pedranam pamchene kegana chibalon chobai Sibe tsole drogen yorosho. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.